We know April is Fair Housing Month, but do we recognize the ways it makes us and Southfield stronger as it benefits neighborhoods, families, and the community? In honor of Fair Housing Month, Southfield sponsored a program called Fair Housing Makes Southfield Stronger. emceed by Southfield real estate agent Dr. Etoile Libet, with commentary and insights provided by several noted speakers, including Mayor Ken Siver, who has written 3 Southfield histories, Marlene Kane from the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, and Margaret Brown from Metropolitan Detroit Fair Housing Center.
Unfortunately, we're living in an age now where, and while we've made a lot of progress as a people in this country, we see forces at work that want to take things back. And I'm thinking particularly of making it more difficult to vote. And the obviously the nonprofit or the Housing Act and the Fairness in Employment, non-discrimination ordinances that have been passed, as well as our policies and practices in the city of Southfield, reflect our desire for equality and equal opportunity for all.
Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968 and the ensuing crisis was the pivotal point contributing to President Johnson's efforts to move housing opportunities forward in 1969.
Few in the nation believed that fair housing would in our time become the unchallenged law of this land. And indeed, this bill has had a long and stormy trip.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The death of the prophet of nonviolence set off the worst outbreak of arson, looting, and criminal activity in the nation's history. Washington's ghettos burned within a few blocks of the nation's capital.
The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. But this I do believe deeply. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him.
President Johnson was willing to speak up and say, we have to pass a fair housing bill.
Hello, Mr. President? Yes, Dick. We're in trouble. We need some help. Yes? I'm afraid of that.
Federal troops, for the first time since the Civil War, took up positions to guard government buildings.
Nothing's probably touchier than your own neighborhood and your own home or your own apartment. The administration, which supported the bill, said this has no chance. The other stuff is okay, but this will kill any politician that touches it.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here because it was a white community.
I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they're allowed to move in here in any number.
seems as though our country is pulling apart into separate societies, where whites have jobs and Negroes have unemployment, where the middle class lives in suburbs and the poor are left in the ghettos, where one group of Americans looks upon another group of Americans with growing mistrust and even dread.
Then the bill went over into the House Rules Committee, and under the chairmanship of the famous Judge Smith, a right-wing segregationist from Virginia, he wouldn't hold hearings on it. He would take the bill home so nobody could act on it, and we were running out of time.
Thousands flowed through the rainy streets of Memphis this day, finishing a march that Dr. King planned to lead in support of striking garbage workers.
How many men must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society?
For your presence, Lord. And I know you'll reach out and take mine. You take our hand.
The death of Martin Luther King is a tragic thing, but no legislation should be passed as a memorial to anyone.
In spite of the riots, I am going to support this legislation with all the vigor that I possess.
The laws that we pass up here are for all time. The Martin Luther Kings come and go.
The public reaction to this horror gave the sensible members of the committee a compelling argument that the House Rules Committee had to report that bill out. And I think that's how we got our bill. They just didn't dare bottle it up any longer.
And I have a dream that one day Negroes will be able to buy a house anywhere that their money will carry them.
At long last this afternoon, fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life. Democracy's work is being done, and the bell of freedom rings out a little louder. We have come some of the way, not near all of it.
The fight still goes on because we unfortunately have the laws, but we don't have the enforcement. That we have changed, but we still have the same kinds of discrimination.
The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said today that efforts by federal agencies to end housing discrimination have been generally superficial or incomplete.
President Carter has ordered federal agencies to use all means possible to strengthen fair housing programs.
For the first time, people with disabilities and families with children will be protected from housing discrimination.
President Reagan signed legislation today designed to toughen up the nation's fair housing laws.
Why did you take part in this demonstration today? Just because there was a huge crowd, or did you have any personal reason?
Well, I took part in this march today because of Martin Luther King and what he stood for, because this march is what he died for.
You know what he stood for?
Yes. He stood for nonviolence and peace for all men of all kinds. And I think if he died for it, I could carry out what he started.
Did you guys know that the film clip that's in this video was the last speech that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did on April 3rd? And it's oh, like I said, it gives you the chills. I heard in the clip his wife, Coretta Scott King, speaking of a free, truthful, and peaceful society. And as you have already shared with us, we're not there yet. We have a lot more work to do. All you have to do is look at the news, look at the papers, and see how much more work there is to do out there. And I thank the mayor and the committee that brought us here today so that we can share information again with you. Well, what can we do to help with this? Well, there are some things we can do to help. We can be informed of what our rights and our responsibilities are. And to know that you can go to the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, HUD, or the Fair Housing Center of Metropolitan Detroit if you have a concern, a question, or a problem.
Unlike the Department of Civil Rights or HUD, the Detroit Fair Housing Commission uses testers. To some people, criminal records, which are not a protected area, have been used in housing discrimination, and HUD has asked that the nature, severity, and amount of time passed since that conviction be considered.
I was asked to talk a little bit about the trends that we are seeing within the department, and there's a few areas that I want to at least share with you. Back in 2016, April 4th, HUD passed what they call HUD-issued guidance, and it has to do with felony records and the process for evaluating somebody with a criminal record. And we've had a handful of cases recently where individuals who have had a felony record have been denied housing opportunities because of that felony. And as you know, or may not know, a criminal record is still not a protected characteristics to which they can file a complaint on. However, for those housing providers that are receiving federal fundings, and those who are not, as a department, we ask them to follow that guidance from HUD, which simply asks to take into account the nature and the severity of that crime and to consider the amount of time that has passed. One individual came to us who had committed a crime 25 years ago, and he has had trouble since then finding housing. He was trying to get into an apartment complex that came up on his record. It was for writing bad checks. And it turned out when we went out to do our on-site visit, they had individuals, and an individual who had that record was African American. He filed on the basis of race. When we went out to do our on-site visit and check records, there were several white tenants currently living there with a lot more recent records and more egregious crimes that have been committed. So, I mean, you cannot do that. They should be looking at these things, and if they don't, when we do our investigation, we will be looking at them. And I want to talk a little bit about disabilities, because how many in here are baby boomers? Okay, there's a good majority of us that are baby boomers. Every 8 seconds, a baby boomer turns age 65. So when I looked at these stats, they talk about the year 2030, which seems so far out, right? But it really isn't. It's just 12 years from now. So people who are age 66 to 84 will number in 2030 at 61 million. Those who were born before 1946, before the baby boom, will be at 9 million. And as people age, some people become or have disabilities. Race and disabilities are the two major factors in housing that people come to us to file complaints on. And it's increasing for disability because of this. So baby boomers, I think, are one of the largest growing numbers that we have in our nation right now. So disability is a broad term, and when we look at complaints, we look at people that have physical or mental disabilities. They have a record of such an impairment, or they're regarded as having an impairment, for instance, somebody who's in a wheelchair. And major life activity is eating, talking, walking, sleeping, breathing. And so when we get complaints, oftentimes people are trying to get a reasonable accommodation. So reasonable accommodation is simply just a change in the rule or policy. For instance, we have many complaints that deal with assistance animals. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later, but They're asking for a waiver of the no pet policy because they have a comfort animal or they have a service animal, and they want to have that service animal live with them as an accommodation to assist them in their disabilities. Another example would be accessible parking. That is a huge area for us as a department. Oftentimes people come because they ask wherever they're living to have an accessible parking spot, and they're denied. And sometimes they do get the spot, but then guess what? They never get to use it because somebody else is already in it. So then we ask for a specific sign that says, this parking spot is reserved for unit 102. And a lot of times respondents don't want to give that because this is what we hear. Well, you're going to start a whole bunch of people asking for that, and then everybody's going to want one. Okay, then you will deal with it when that comes. But for now, this person needs to have an accessible sign close to their unit because they have a mobility impairment. Assistance animals take up about 40% of our cases right now. Yes, it's very big. And so I want to just describe the difference between a service animal and an emotional support or comfort animal, because this is a very, very large amount of people that come to us with these questions. I get at least 10 calls a day. Basically, a service animal is for somebody who has a disability. The animal has been trained to do something for their owner. For instance, we have people who have vision impairments, and that dog guides them. We also have had service animals that can alert their owner to the fact that they're going to have a seizure, so they'll get low to the ground. Low blood sugar, an animal will know by licking their owner that their sugar is low, and they can alert them to the fact that they need to get some help. And then we have the comfort or emotional support animals who are not trained. They're simply there to ameliorate the condition, the disability condition for that individual. For instance, somebody who has an anxiety disorder may need a cat or a dog, and that animal provides them the ability to get up out of bed and take the dog for a walk, interact with others, and get out and about versus laying in bed, because they're full of anxiety. So that animal is providing them a service. But they're not trained. They don't have to be trained. And oftentimes, people get those two confused. The person who has the assistance animal, the emotional support or comfort animal, has to maintain control of that animal. They can't let the animal bite people or run amok or bark insistently throughout the night. They have to have control over it when they're out in the community. But HUD guidance is very clear, and unless there's something happening that we're not seeing, with that dog, they have to allow that dog to stay. They cannot charge the dog extra fees, extra deposit. And they have to, can't subject that dog to additional things that they normally wouldn't do. For instance, we have some respondents that are requiring comfort animals to be neutered. They don't do that for their pet policy. I want to talk a little bit about retaliation because we don't always get to talk about it in these forums, but if somebody files a civil rights complaint, opposes a civil rights complaint, or is a participant in a civil rights complaint, and they are subjected to retaliation, that is against the law, and they can file a complaint as well. For instance, we've had some complaints before where somebody was a witness for the claimant. The respondent found out and then gave that person an eviction notice. So that you can't do that. So that person filed a complaint, and that person was not evicted. But I just wanted it to be known, because if you do participate or you file a complaint or you know somebody who has and you are a witness, they cannot retaliate against you. And just a couple of other things I wanted to mention. Smoking is really becoming a huge issue. When I say smoking, I mean people who live in apartments, townhomes, condos, and somebody has a breathing impairment, they have asthma, or they're on oxygen, and they're smelling the smoke from their neighbor because all the, units are connected and the heating ducts and such. We've had a lot of those complaints. It's not illegal to smoke in your unit, so we can't make them stop smoking. However, there are some things that can be done. We actually go out and do smoking tests. We will be in the unit, ask the person to smoke, and see. I'm really highly allergic to smoke, so I usually go out and do this to see if you could smell it. So some of the things we kind of come up with thinking out of the box is maybe if there's extra caulking that can be done that would stop that smoke from coming through, if there's a way to block that smoke, air purifiers, Sometimes there are apartment buildings and the neighbor next door smoking like 8 packs a day. They can put those little things on the bottom of the door to keep the smoke from coming in. Sometimes that helps and sometimes it doesn't. But a lot of the complexes that are receiving federal funding are now trying to move towards having smoke-free units to avoid that.
The Fair Housing Justice Center is a nonprofit civil rights organization based here in New York City. What we did this past week here in New York is to test in a predominantly white neighborhood and sent L.B. Williams and Norman Lear. And we actually have an audio and video account of what occurred during these visits. So this is L.B.'s recording.
Hi. Are you the landlord? My wife and I are looking for a one-bedroom apartment.
Last month I rented 1, 2 months ago I rented 2.
Okay.
At the moment I have no vacancies here.
Okay, no vacancies?
No, at the moment.
Okay, when do you think you have one that will be available?
1 bedroom I don't expect, 2 bedroom I don't expect. Maybe a studio, middle of next month.
Okay.
But he clearly said there was no 1 bedroom available.
Clearly. He said it several times.
So this was basically Tuesday night, and then Wednesday morning, you visited the same agent.
Hey, my wife was out here the other day, and I guess she saw that sign. We were looking for a 1-bedroom apartment.
I'm going to have a studio here, and I have 1 bedroom in Pelham.
I think I know where that is. And it's
Further look at studio, I'm going to have end of the month.
terrific. I thank you very much, sir.
You got told about a studio apartment in that building that was coming available.
A 1-bedroom apartment was available, which he's willing to show me, and a studio.
Yeah, and the 1 bedroom, according to the recording, is in Pelham Bay on Wellman Avenue, another predominantly white neighborhood.
It always saddens me. It consistently says to me, as an African American, that I'm less than. And that's a horrible feeling to feel.
And bullying, the last thing I wanted to mention is bullying. We see bullying in senior complexes. You wouldn't believe it. And it's usually a race issue. So we've had to come in and do training just for the people who live in the complex to let them know, okay, this is your rights, but these are your responsibilities. And you can be held accountable if you're using racial epithets or trying to hit somebody. So it's been kind of interesting. We see a gamut of things, but we're out there trying to make a difference. And lastly, I just wanted to mention, our department recently hired a racial equity officer, and that officer is responsible for training the staff. And we've had a lot of training. Actually, the director and many of the executive staff they're currently at a training on racial equity. That's why the director couldn't be here today. But I think it's so important because everything that we do, they're looking at the racial equity of it. So for instance, in housing, if we're looking at a case and somebody was denied an accessible parking spot, we're just not looking at that. We're looking at their applications. We're looking at their policies and their procedures. We're looking at, is the place accessible? Should it be accessible? There's a gamut of things we're looking at in terms of making sure that we're looking at the racial side of that as well. So that's something new that the department has done. It's not something new that we're doing in housing because we always have done that. But in terms of the other side of the coin, we also take complaints in employment, public accommodation, public services, law enforcement, and education. So it's going to be applied in those arenas as well. So we have some very exciting things coming, and we're going to continue to do the work that we do. We have a lot of passion, and we have a lot of contacts. And we try to do the best we can to get people to resolve issues. That's our number one goal, because we don't want people to be out of housing. That's for certain. And we want to make sure that they're following the Fair Housing Act, the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, and the Persons with Disability Civil Rights Act.
I may have been discriminated against is often the first thing heard in the 150 fair housing centers across the country. I didn't know that the Fair Housing Center of Metropolitan Detroit has been in existence since 1977, serving Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties.
When someone calls our office, they say, I think I may have been discriminated against, and we ask them to do an intake form and tell their story. Marlene said that the number one reason that people complain to her office is race. That's true for us. If you were talking to HUD, they would tell you the number one reason is people with disabilities. Our number two is families with children. So I'll get to that in a little while. And our number three is people with disabilities. So that's the difference in terms of our service area and the number of complaints that we get. Last year, we received 222 complaints. We probably could have gotten more if more people knew that their rights had been violated, because you only complain when you realize that there might be something wrong. What do? When we take the information, the first thing we do is we try to comprise a team of testers. They can be testers that communicate by phone. More likely than not, we send a pair of testers out, and they go out in person. We currently have a lawsuit against a very large developer. He has over 11 loft apartments in Midtown, downtown Detroit. And we have filed a lawsuit against him, his company, his management company, because an individual contacted us and they said that they applied for an apartment, a loft apartment in one of the buildings, and everything was going great. This is a white female. She went and applied, completed her application, passed the background check, passed the credit check. Everything was going great. She was told to come in and sign the lease and get her keys. On the day that she arrived to sign the lease and get her keys, she brought her husband and 2 children with her. When she arrived, the on-site management told her, "Oh, I am so sorry. I didn't realize you had children. We don't rent to people with children." It has been against the law to discriminate against families with children since 1988. But that was what she was told. She said, "I'll check with the owner, but I'm pretty sure that that's our policy." And so the couple left without signing the lease, without getting the keys. And that evening, the on-site called them and they said, "We've had a staff meeting. And in our staff meeting, the owner confirmed that I was correct. We don't accept children. I am so, so sorry that this has happened to you, but you have my apologies, but there's nothing that I can do about it." Luckily for us, they weren't home when that message was left on their voicemail. And luckily for us and for them, the husband saved the message. So, fast forward 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later, a black female called. She had called the same complex, inquired about housing, and she was also told that they didn't accept children. In fact, they asked her what the age of her child was. She told them that she had a 6-year-old, and they said, "Oh, too bad, we accept if you had children 8 years of age or older." So she called our office, filed a complaint. The Fair Housing Act allows 2 things to happen. If you are an individual, as the first person was, who wants to remain anonymous, the Fair Housing Center can step into their place. We can file a lawsuit in our own name. Civil rights can't file a lawsuit in their own name, but we can. So we stood in the place of the anonymous complainant. The second person filed a lawsuit in her own name. But we need evidence, right? We've got their statement, we've got the video, but we need a little bit more. So we sent out teams of testers. We sent out a team. Our test coordinators will create a profile. We'll say, when you go out, you are to be of a certain, well, you're going to be whatever age you are, but you're going to have this income, you're going to have this occupation, you're going to have this background in terms of your education. We give them a profile. They go out, and so we had one set of testers go out and somehow introduce into the conversation that they didn't have any children. See how they're treated. We have another set to go out and say, I have children. Somehow make sure that it comes up in the conversation. And then they write a report that they send back to us. We analyze it and categorize it. And in this case, we sent out 7 teams of testers. And they were all told various things, but the bottom line is the ones who said they had children were almost always told that they didn't accept children. Based on that evidence, based on the statements of the 2 complainants, we file a claim in federal court. Now, the law allows you to file with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. If you think you've been discriminated against, you can go straight to HUD. If you think you've been discriminated against, you can go to agencies such as ours and file a complaint with us, or you can go straight to court. The law does not say that you have to wait until you've gone through these, what some call administrative remedies. You can go straight to court. Most people, if they're going to their own private attorneys, can't afford the retainer that most attorneys would ask to take on this kind of case. The attorneys that work for us, we call them cooperating attorneys, they work on contingency, meaning that they will not charge a fee unless they actually win the case. So, but in order to win a case, you have to have evidence. You can't win in a court of law without evidence. So the testers become essential to that regard, because without them, oftentimes we wouldn't have the evidence that we need.
Margaret Brown lives in Southfield and has a personal story about relocation into the city that represents what she is talking about.
I had an office in Lansing, I had an office in Detroit, and I commuted back and forth for years. But I decided I wanted to move back to this part of the state, and I started looking for a house. And I found the house that was truly a fixer-upper. But I found the house that fit my, what I was willing to pay, and it was here in Southfield. And I wanted to know what the crime rate was for this neighborhood, so I called the police department. And I asked if, they had any crime statistics. Now, this is 22 years ago. Now you can go online and sort of look up a lot of this stuff, but 22 years ago it wasn't available online. So I called the police department, and a female officer answered the phone, and I asked, I thought in a polite, calm manner, if they had any information about the crime statistics in this neighborhood. And she told me that information was not available. If I wanted it, I had to write a letter to the city attorney's office under the Freedom of Information Act in order to get it. Struck me as odd. So I hung up the phone, and I went over to Sandy, and I said, Sandy, stand up. Sandy looks a lot like her, okay? I went over to Sandy. You can sit down now. And I said, Sandy, call this number. And I wrote down what I wanted her to ask. And she did it. And when she called, they said, oh, you would love living in the city of Southfield. We have great amenities, we have great residents, and they went on to talk to her for 30 minutes to go on and on about how great the city of Southfield is. I've been here for 22 years, I agree with them, but I was a little miffed that they told me. So that was my private testing that I did. And sometimes we run into people who file complaints with us and they've done their own private testing. So that person, that Sandy person, could become a witness for a future case. I didn't file a complaint. I did buy the house. I do enjoy the house. But, it illustrates how testing can show a very, very stark difference in treatment. Their new initiative is to make sure that people understand that sexual harassment is covered by the Fair Housing Act. A lot of people don't know that. They've had some cases where people are told things such as, I'll give you a free apartment because I see you're down on your luck, understand, and they'll give you a chance, we'll let you live here free. And I've had this one case that I investigated. I asked the woman, did you really think that free meant free? She believed, she swore that she had just lost her job, she had spent most of her savings, she really needed a place to stay, and, this man said that he, was just trying to help her out. And he had a couple of vacancies, he didn't mind if she stayed there free of charge, so she moved in. About 3 months later, he was working late, and she heard a knock at her door. She opened the door, and he was standing there with a bottle of liquor, and he asked, could he come in? And she said, it's late, whatever she said she was doing the next day, and she told him that he couldn't come in. The next day, she had an eviction notice. Because free didn't necessarily mean free. I like that story, and it illustrates that, sexual harassment is occurring in housing, and a lot of people don't know that, and that, that in of itself is another basis for someone to file a complaint with any of the parties that you want to file a complaint with.
Evidence and documentation can be definitive in resolving these issues and complaints. Know the process.
I guess I'd want to make sure that if they're complaining of these things, that they're doing it with the paper trail. So is there a process for maintenance requests? Then I would say, make sure you follow that process, and if you have a maintenance request, go in there and ask them, stamp it, and make me a copy. And that way, at least you have that. And I have to tell you, these cell phones are amazing. We have had people come to us with respondents who have said, no, I never said that. They never came in here. We have a video of that person saying that. So I would video it. Some people just tell me they just put it like this and video the whole thing. Make sure you document that you're asking for these things to be done, because guess what they're going to tell us? They never came to us. They never said nothing. We had no clue this was happening. How can we fix it if we don't know? Then we get back to the claimant. What do you have? So I would say documentation is the key to that. In terms of what you're doing as a city, every other city is doing that and should be doing it, because people are in situations now where their kids are living in conditions that are unsafe, unhealthy, and I'm not saying all landlords, but some landlords don't do anything about it.
Knowing local laws are important, but housing providers should be trained annually, and that training should be monitored and reported on.
I think first off, if you're not having the fair housing training on an annual basis, you should be. That's number one. I know in the cases that we've had people staring people in certain neighborhoods based upon their race, making inappropriate comments that are discriminatory in nature, and you're there to show the home. You're not there to tell them about anything else. Just describe the property, not the people, not, those kind of things you refrain from doing, because then you run into problems.
You're supposed to show me everything that's on the multi-listing book that fits my price range that meets those criteria. What you shouldn't say, oh, you may not feel comfortable living in Beverly Hills. How do you know what I feel comfortable living in? Mm-hmm. This is where folks say, oh, we'll show you Detroit, Inkster, and Ecorse, but we won't show you Dearborn, we won't show you. Why? They wanted a certain type of structure, and you're supposed to show them everything that pops up on your multi-family list that shows up that meets that. No exceptions. Now they can tell you, I only want to look at certain communities. That's their choice, but you don't get to choose for them. And a lot of realtors seem to not know that, so that's where the training comes in. You don't get to choose for them.
Right.
As Martin Luther King has said, We have come some of the way, not near all of it. But what we can do to help was answered in part by Southfield's Human Rights Ordinance passed in 2015. As either owners or prospective owners, we have rights according to the Fair Housing Act of 1968 and Southfield's Human Rights Ordinance passed in 2015. To find out more about the Michigan Civil Rights Department, you can call 800-482-3604. To find out more about the Detroit Fair Housing Commission, you can call 313-963-1274.